My name's Steve Strauss. I'm a professor in the Department of Forest Ecosystems and Society at OSU and director of the OSU Outreach and Biotechnology Program. Along with my co-lead of the lecture series, John Lambrinos of the Department of Horticulture, it's our pleasure to welcome you tonight. This is the last lecture of 4 that we've presented this academic year, which is the 5th year of this Food for Thought lecture series. The series focuses on biotechnology and related environmental and agricultural issues, and is sponsored by the American Society for Plant Biology, the Weight and Lois Rising Lectureship Fund from the College of Agricultural Sciences, and the OSU College of Forestry. James McWilliams is a historian who understands the science of food and agriculture well. He is an associate professor at Texas State University in San Marcos, which, if you're like me and don't know your Texas geography all that well, it's quite close to Austin. He obtained his BA at Georgetown, master's degrees at Harvard and the University of Texas at Austin, and a PhD at Johns Hopkins. He was the winner of the 2001 Whitehall Prize in Colonial History and received the University Honors Advisor of the Year Award at Texas State in 2003, which, along with his service as faculty advisor for the Water Polo Club, indicates, I think, that he is a likable, caring, and possibly a fun mentor. Dr. McWilliams has published 4 books, 3 on food and agriculture. These include A Revolution in Eating, How the Quest for Food Shaped America, American Pests, The Losing War on Insects from Colonial Times to DDT, and published just year and available for sale out in the hallway, Just Food, How Locavores are Endangering the Future of Food and How We Can Truly Eat Responsibly. Dr. McWilliams has also contributed a great deal to public discussions of food and agriculture, which have included numerous invitations for guest lectures, radio interviews, and contributed pieces in newspapers. A couple of my favorite titles of his were, first in the New York Times, Out of Our Gourds, and Food Politics Half-Baked. An invited lecture at Yale was entitled, Let Us Spray, The Origins of Insecticides in the United States. His public contributions in the 2 lectures he's already given to classes at OSU today, yes, we've been working him quite hard, make it clear that although he is addressing highly controversial issues, he also does so with wit and humility. Go green. Eat local. Stop industrial agriculture. Ban GMOs. There are a few areas that do more to polarize and impassion people than food and associated environmental problems. Unfortunately, such passions often displace reason, prompting slogans in place of rationality and nuance. This gap in public dialogue is the niche where James McWilliams works. In Just Food, he writes, quote, "Something about food fosters radical dichotomies. We instinctively feel an overwhelming desire to take sides, organic or conventional, fair or free trade, wild or farm-raised fish. Like most things in life, the sensible answer lies somewhere between the extremes, somewhere in that dull but respectable place we call the pragmatic center. To be a centrist when it comes to food is, unfortunately, to be a radical." In Just Food, Dr. McWilliams further proposes that this tendency to oversimplify is associated with a romantic misunderstanding of agriculture and its history. Quote, "The more I thought, read, and wrote about such divisive matters as biotechnology, aquaculture, factory farming, and the organic revolution, the more it became clear to me that each issue, in one way or another, has been distorted by a popular misunderstanding of agriculture. This misunderstanding ultimately boils down to the misleading allure of a lost golden age of food production. Thing is, there was no golden age." Tonight, Dr. McWilliams will seek to provide us with a more balanced, nuanced, and historically accurate sense of what sustainable agriculture means and where it needs to be going. So please help me in welcoming James McWilliams to Oregon State.
Thank you to Dr. Strauss for that very generous introduction and for inviting me to come and give this talk. And thanks to everyone for taking time on this really quite beautiful day to come inside and hear me talk about food and agriculture. I'm up here today as a historian deeply concerned about the future. Having spent the better part of a decade studying the history of food and agriculture, I recently dropped everything and dedicated myself to studying food and agriculture in the here and now. We're facing a potentially devastating global crisis. It's a crisis that hinges on the fact that global population will grow from 6 billion to 9 billion by 2050. During this time, farmers will have to produce 70% more food in order to avoid systematic starvation. Perhaps most dauntingly, this 70% increase will have to take place with minimal land expansion. How the world will solve this problem in an environmentally responsible way is one of the most pressing problems we face. It's the topic of my talk today. One popular answer to this demographic challenge comes from a select but very influential group of food reformers or agricultural reformers who advocate a return to the small family farm. These reformers, motivated largely by a legitimate distrust of agribusiness, promote scaled down and decentralized farms serving local markets as a viable answer to the world's impending food crisis. This is an appealing solution, and in many ways it's one that I support. It has many benefits that I'm aware of and that I've been, I think, quite active about celebrating. Still, I do think it would be a grave mistake to cast our lot with small systems alone. Given that our top agricultural priority is to intensify production while respecting the environment, we're going to need some form of industrial agriculture to capitalize on density, provide an infrastructure for global distribution, and produce enough accessible, safe, and affordable food to feed not just our privileged first world enclaves, but the rest of the world as well. We face this task with no historical model to draw on. We're literally on our own by ourselves, and the clock, as it will do, is ticking. To address this very large problem in, less than an hour, I'm going to try and do three things. One, I'm going to summarize the basic premises from which I work, just so you know where I'm coming from. Then I'm going to discuss 4 principles that I see as necessary to achieving sustainable global agriculture. And then finally, I'm going to focus with a little more depth on what I see to be the most critical and direct behavioral change we can make in order to do our part for this global cause. Let me start with my premises, and I'm just going to go over 2. The first general premise that I take when I think about agriculture is this: nature is no farmer. Agricultural reformers like to say that agriculture works best when it follows the patterns of nature. Agriculture, by definition, is about human intervention and selectivity. By its very essence, the act of farming manipulates nature in order to serve our increasing caloric needs. 80% of the world's plant diet comes from 12 plants. None of these plants, not to mention all the other 20%, would be edible were it not for the visible and quite heavy hand of man. Many of them, in fact, would make us quite sick in their undomesticated form. The only environmental benefit that I can see coming from depending on nature to provide our food would be a rapid decline in global population. We would go hungry. The second premise is that big, when it comes to agriculture, does not have to be bad. The small farm paradigm may not be the ideal way to achieve density of production. Nevertheless, we need small producers. We need small farms. We need them to increase diversity. We need them to add value and to meet specialized consumer demands. The most realistic way, as I see it, for small farms, for small local farms to thrive in the long term is to form productive links with larger farms. In a globalizing economy driven by market principles, small farms will have a very hard time competing against better capitalized farms capable of taking advantage of scale economies and processing infrastructures. They'll either be muscled out or have to grow big themselves, and we've seen that happen to some extent in the organic industry. Unless industrial capitalism is overthrown, this is the logic that will prevail. Consider supply chains as they now exist, and you'll see that overlaps between big and small systems already exist, and that these overlaps can be quite productive. Take polyface farms. Anyone who's read Michael Pollan's Omnivore's Dilemma or seen Food Inc. will have met Joel Salatin, the owner of polyface farms, quite an eccentric character. And he prides himself on his pastured animals and rotational grazing schemes. In a lot of ways, Salatin has become the kind of poster boy for the sustainable local system that's off the grid of industrial agriculture. But the animals that Salatin grazes are, and this is for purely economic reasons, they're all conventional breeds. All of them have been bred industrially for one reason, and that is to fatten fast. We're talking about breeds such as Cornish crosses and butterballs, birds that are so grossly deformed through selective pressure that they cannot reproduce on their own. In buying from industrial breeders and then finishing his birds, in an idyllic context, Salatin, whether he admits it or not, is really joined to the hip of industrial agriculture, and clearly this has advantages for Joel. I say that instead of downplaying these relationships, which often happens. I'm not just choosing this as an anomaly. Most supply chains that I've looked at of small producers do eventually turn up and overlap with an industrial system. I don't think we should obscure these relationships, but highlight them, make them transparent, and start helping small farmers, or start helping these relationships with big industrial producers become more advantageous for the small niche producers. These premises, general as they may be, support four principles required to achieve sustainable global food production. And these are just four. There are certainly many others we could come up with, and frankly, these are four that I think will work, but somebody could come up with four others that could work a whole lot better. But these are the ones I've chosen to talk about. My first premise, or rather, my first principle, is that we need to transcend the organic conventional divide. About 2% of agricultural production in the United States is certified organic. Most of the other 98% is conventionally grown. The chance that conventional farmers will, in any significant multitude, convert to organic production is minuscule. Pragmatically speaking, we should not be dichotomizing these systems and then promoting organic agriculture as a viable substitute or model for conversion. I have all the respect in the world for organic agriculture, and I like to think I have a fairly sophisticated understanding of its benefits, but I think it makes much better sense to explore how conventional agriculture can realistically achieve genuine environmental gains without going whole hog organic. Just from experience, the conventional growers that I have interviewed and talked with over the years have made it very clear to me that they would go organic over their dead bodies. It's just not something that they're inclined to do in general. They like their weapons, and they don't want to give those weapons up. We spent a lot of time in this country debating the relative pros and cons of organic and conventional agriculture. As I see it, we can either get bogged down in endlessly debating the merits or demerits of each method of production, or more productively, we can look ahead to ecologically sound solutions that can, with the right incentives, be readily adopted by the 98% of conventional growers seeking higher yields on less land with fewer inputs. My sense, and again, this is just after talking to conventional farmers, is that conventional growers would welcome the chance to be better stewards of the environment, as would the companies that they work for. Such solutions are not limited to, but might include such options as precision farming, which is using global positioning systems and information systems, global positioning satellites and geographical information systems to map variability, nutrient variability, water variability, and apply nutrients and water with pinpoint accuracy rather than just indiscriminately spraying pesticides or indiscriminately adding fertilizer or water. You can only add these where they are needed as a result of this technology. We might also want to look very closely at fertilizers endowed with better nitrogen uptake efficiency. This is a concept I've had a very difficult time convincing many of the media outlets that I write for to write about. But as it turns out, the fertilizers that conventional farmers use today are extremely cheap fertilizers, and they're not well made. And so the nitrogen hits the soil and dumps out all at once and runs off. 70%, 80% of the nitrogen from synthetic fertilizer runs off and leads to dead zones and damages aquatic ecosystems. Well, it turns out that there are much better engineered, much more expensive fertilizers where the opposite is the case. The nitrogen actually seeps out very slowly in a kind of time-release fashion, and the plants take up the nitrogen much more effectively and to the tune of 70 and 80%, thus leading to only 20 or 30% of the nitrogen running off, thereby minimizing the damage. We might also want to look at slow drip irrigation systems that, according to the U.S. Geological Survey, can cut agricultural water usage in half. The other things that kind of excite me, and these are a bit more futuristic, again, thinking beyond organic and conventional, exploring these technologies that are in their infancy right now. Saltwater greenhouses are starting to be built in areas where the desert hits the ocean, and essentially the way they work is you have on-site desalination plants that are powered with solar energy. They take the ocean water, they remove the salt, and they use the fresh water to grow quite high-yielding quite high-yielding fruits and vegetables within the greenhouse. The one on the left is an actual saltwater greenhouse. The one on the right is a rather ambitious mock-up, but you got to think big. Again, vertical farming is another one of these things, although after having lunch with a couple of people today that told me, oh, vertical farming, it's never going to work because of the light issues. But I don't know, I can't help but get excited about it. Here we have a small example of vertical farming, and then, of course, is another highly ambitious and perhaps idealized mock-up on the right. I think it's worth thinking about some of these futuristic potential solutions. Again, if for no other reason, then it can help us grow food in areas like urban centers or in deserts, but also because both of these technologies do focus heavily on density of production, which again I think has to be the term that we sort of focus on over and over again. According to some estimates, and they're only estimates, so we have to take them with a grain of salt, but a square city block that was dedicated to vertical farming could produce vegetables and fruits for upwards of 50,000 people. Another one that I've looked into and write about actually to some extent in my book is aquaponics or aquaculture, growing fish in a localized and highly controlled environment. And again, the inputs can be extremely well managed and the output is really quite high. So those are some ways that I think we can start transcending the conventional organic paradigm, which really I think does us very little good. The second principle is that we should keep the benefits of local farming in perspective. A defining feature of the food movement has been to demand that our food come from local sources. We've all heard this. It makes perfect sense, and I do support it, and I do buy locally. I have to say, give these qualifications because I'm often looked at with deep suspicion when I criticize the locavore movement. I belong to my CSA. I go to my farmer's market. I understand the values that drive this very important movement, and I respect that this movement has done more than anything I can think of to get average people, average consumers to look at where their food comes from. All good. So it makes sense, but only to a point. There are many advantages to localizing our far-flung food system. But my fear is that as we continue to celebrate local production, we'll lose sight of the global dimension of the problems we face, the problem that I laid out at the very beginning of my talk. Granting, then, that the benefits of a locally sourced diet are many and well known, allow me to push back a little bit on the locavore logic. First, local does not necessarily mean more energy efficient. Transportation. And let me just sort of explain this image behind me. It's not very easy to see, but the bottom line is that the maroon on the left, the maroon designation represents transportation and the energy consumed by transportation in the overall life cycle of a particular food product. The yellow, the gold, however, represents production. And so the point here is that transportation, which is the factor that locavores highlight, is the key energy hogging culprit. You've got to lower your food miles. It's actually just a fractional source of the overall energy consumption in food production. Life cycle analyses routinely show transportation to be about 10% of the overall energy usage in production. The largest source of energy usage, as I mentioned here, is production, weighing in about 30 to even 70%. Second, there are the inherent benefits of scale to consider when we're thinking about local production. As we evaluate the carbon footprint of our diets, we must consider the fact that a mile driven by a semi-truck packed full of groceries is likely more energy efficient than several boxes of vegetables trucked to market by a local farmer. The critical question is not how far our food has traveled, but what the miles per product were. 2,000 oranges driven 1,000 miles equals 2 oranges per mile. 100 oranges driven 100 miles to market is 1 orange per mile. I'm just making these numbers up, but they illustrate my point that scale can easily work against small farmers serving local markets. Finally, an emphasis on eating local obscures a much more environmentally significant point. What we eat is far more important than where it comes from. Reducing meat consumption has a far greater influence on lowering our carbon footprint than locally sourcing our food does. In fact, cutting meat, according to a recent Carnegie Mellon study, cutting meat from our diet, and this is the average American diet, which is very high in meat, but cutting meat from our diet once a week, just taking one day and acting like a vegetarian, would have the same environmental impact as eating all of our food within a 100-mile radius of where we live. To me, that really puts the matter in perspective. As a consumer, if your concern is to lower the carbon footprint of your diet, by far the most effective thing you can do is make your diet more plant-based. More on this later. Third principle is that we need to explore more environmentally sound applications of transgenic technology, genetic modification. This one's a minefield. Transgenic crops are now employed by a handful of ill-behaved companies, primarily to develop 2 traits: insect resistance or herbicide resistance. And they're being primarily applied to 3 crops alone: corn, cotton, and soy. These heavily subsidized and monoculturally produced crops require enormous amounts of water. They rarely make it into the mouths of people, at least not directly. Well, cotton, of course, doesn't, but... And they press hard. Well, you know, there is, I think cottonseed oil is used for some things, but... And they press hard upon rainforests and other precious ecosystems. So while I'm the first to admit that Monsanto is no angel, I'll join you in throwing tomatoes at Monsanto. I also believe that just because we might dislike Monsanto does not mean we should automatically dismiss the technology it seeks to monopolize. A more rational approach to transgenic technology would be to support its research and application to developing key food crops in developing countries. I should say that when I went into this research, I was familiar with genetic modification only through what I had read in popular media reports, and I had every intention of writing a rather scathing chapter on this technology and the crops that they were producing. And instead, I didn't stop with those media reports. I went and interviewed scientists who were actually doing genetic modification without any kind of corporate affiliation. And it's through those interviews that I developed a more nuanced perspective on this technology. Scientists without corporate affiliation have spent years doing just this, that is, developing key food crops, specialty crops in developing countries. They're manipulating plant genes to develop new traits for new crops, traits such as bacteria-resistant rice, drought-tolerant sweet potatoes, salt-tolerant cassava, and high-yielding millet. These are fundamentally different applications of transgenic technology, ones that, in my opinion, are at once more humane and environmentally minded. Let me be specific about some of the potentially sustainable applications of transgenic technology. Grass-fed cows, which I'm going to talk more about shortly. Grass-fed cows produce 3 to 4 times the methane that conventional ones do. They do this because they eat grass. However, there is a genetically modified grass developed by Genentech, an Australian company, that prevents cows from emitting methane, thus potentially alleviating this serious environmental problem. Earlier, I mentioned the problem of nitrogen uptake with fertilizers. Well, several plants have been genetically modified by Arcadia Biosciences to increase their ability to absorb nitrogen, something that, enjoined with better fertilizers, could significantly reduce nitrogen runoff. Then there's rice that's been genetically modified by UC Davis scientists to withstand floods in Southeast Asia and grow faster under drier conditions in Africa, thereby boosting yields under adverse circumstances for poor populations caught in the grip of climate change. If you've read a bit about climate change, one of the things you'll learn is that it's going to impact developing countries much more than it will impact developed countries. So these innovations that I've just talked about do not promote monoculture, but rather agricultural diversification, output, and resource management. Now, I don't mean to suggest that there aren't potential dangers with this technology. I'm well aware of them. Mixing genes can certainly have unintended consequences. We've all heard about the threat of allergens and superweeds and a narrowing genetic base. And in fact, just like last week, the National Science, am I getting that right? The National Science Foundation, the National Academy of Sciences, thank you, came out with a report, comprehensive report looking at the performance of basically corn and soy and cotton, the GM varieties of those seeds, and found that many of the gains in terms of yield, in terms of reduced pesticide application, in terms of applying less harmful pesticides, or rather herbicides, have been achieved. But one area where there's a real danger has to do with weed resistance, and this is something that's going to pose a real problem, I think, in the future for the monocultural application of these transgenic crops. So these are problems, and I'm aware of them, but to a significant degree, these dangers are also the dangers of plant breeding in general. They apply to conventional breeding as well as they apply to transgenic technology. So to take these problems and place them at the feet of transgenic technology as alone is slightly disingenuous. Perhaps the most common opposition to this technology, besides sheer hatred of the corporations that own it, is that it's not natural. DNA, they say, should not cross species. But as I have said, agriculture itself is really not natural. And as one impossibly young plant biologist that I interviewed in Austin, Texas told me, dude, DNA is DNA. Plus, when critics of this technology condemn it as being unnatural, they should be reminded that this unnatural technology is integral to gene therapy, research being applied to help cure Huntington's disease, cystic fibrosis, and Lou Gehrig's disease. The drug insulin is now bioengineered through this unnatural technology. Many vaccines, including those for hepatitis B and malaria, have become much safer and more readily available as a result of this unnatural technology. So transgenic technology, GMOs, is no magic bullet. It is, though, a potentially valuable tool in the agricultural toolbox. Fourth principle, we need to make food producers swallow the true costs of production. This is a political issue. This is a really invaluable website. It's run and updated by the Environmental Working Group, and it tracks subsidies. The United States spends over $300 million a year in subsidies, and you can follow where they go down to the top 5 celebrity recipients, if you wish, or to any old farmer who gets subsidies. Truly, truly remarkable database reflecting heroic efforts on the part of the Environmental Working Group. With few exceptions, food producers are not going to reduce pollution out of concern for you, for me, or for the common good. What's needed are structural economic incentives to reward both density of production and low environmental impact. This should be done by expanding rather than curtailing the logic of the market economy. If we place a monetary value on natural resources, granted something that makes environmentalists extremely uncomfortable, but if we place a monetary value on natural resources, the calculus of production changes radically. Damages to air, damages to soil, and damages to water and biodiversity become part of the cost of production. In essence, if we require producers to pay the true cost of production rather than externalizing those costs, there will be powerful incentives for agriculture to reduce runoff, soil erosion, greenhouse gas emission, and water damage. Companies will profit by going green. We can also attack this problem from the angle of subsidies. The U.S. currently spends, as I mentioned, over $300 million a year in perverse subsidies, as they're called. The main beneficiaries are the corn and livestock industries. Producers, in short, are paid handsomely by the federal government, well, really by us, through our tax dollars, to maximize corn production in order to feed it to livestock and ethanol plants, thus staying mired in the rut of dangerous and environmentally unsound monocultural production. This is simply structured environmental degradation. But if subsidies were cut, or even better, restructured, and applied to things like precision farming or high-end fertilizers or slow drip irrigation systems, choose your technology. If they were cut or restructured and environmental costs were internalized, things would change dramatically, both for consumers and for producers. A pound of ground beef, if the true cost of productions were factored in, would cost $35 at the supermarket. The cost of grazing livestock on public lands for ranchers would go up 700%. Currently, the cost of grazing a cow on public land is less than it costs to feed a cat. Eliminating perverse subsidies, as politically sensitive a matter as it is is not as unrealistic as it sounds. Earlier this year, Charlie Stenholm, a former congressman from Texas who designed the subsidies that so lavishly rewarded his district and kept him in Congress for a very long time, told a meeting of the American Farm Bureau, and I have to tell you, I mean, as somebody who follows this stuff fairly closely, I almost fell out of my chair. Quote, "We're evolving into an agriculture that will be non-subsidized," he told them. "Get ready for it." His reason was that with the economic recession and a federal debt expected to reach $15 trillion by 2016, ag subsidies will no longer be affordable. But we don't have to wait for an economic recession or an increasing deficit to make this happen. We simply have to muster political will. If I were king, I'd do 4 things. 1, create a tax structure based on agricultural diversity, density, and conversion efficiencies. 2, create subsidies that supported the use of capital-intensive technologies to grow more plants on less land. 3, employ polluter pay principles, also known to economists as Pigovian taxes, so that producers are paid for the pollution they create, so that producers paid for the pollution they created and were rewarded for the pollution they avoided. And finally, impose a direct and highly punitive tax on meat production and fast food. None of these would be politically expedient. Imagine that's why you're laughing. But neither was passing a health care bill. At this point, you might be thinking, this guy, he's got to be in bed with agribusiness, right? So many things I say get interpreted as supporting the industrial model. That's about to change. My premises and my principles all lead into my last topic, one I'll spend a little more time on, and that is meat. In a way, everything Texas, by the way. In a way, everything I've discussed is dependent in one way or another on reducing global meat consumption. I see this as our primary challenge. Fortunately, it's one that, as individuals, we have the most control over. Americans kill 10 billion land animals a year for food. Of those 10 billion, 99% are grown in the most environmentally hazardous way. Factory farms form the core of industrial agriculture. The most direct thing we can do as consumers to take on agribusiness is to avoid meat that's factory raised. But here's the catch. We also have to realize that we cannot replace all the meat we eat with alternatively raised meat. Free range, cage-free, grass-fed, and other highly publicized alternatives might be improvements on the factory farm model. They are, in fact. But they each have their own problems that will only intensify with expanding population. I know that when Steve introduced me, he said he's going to get up there and he's going to be reasonable and fair-minded. And I was reasonable and fair-minded in my book, but I have to say that since my book has come out and I've done more research into this topic, I'm starting to become much more of an advocate on this issue, perhaps, than I ever intended to be. But the logic is becoming increasingly persuasive to me. We simply have to eat less meat, and even more importantly, we have to somehow convince China and India to halt their trend, their rather frightening trend towards increased meat consumption as they become globalized, wealthier, and more capable of assuming a Western diet. As I've said before, we in this country export a lot of valuable things, but our diet is not one of those. A few statistics placed, and I'm just going to put these sources up here, so in case you want to, and anyone who wants this PowerPoint sent to them, I'm happy to do that as well. I'll put my email back up at the end. This will be on the website too, okay. A few statistics place the environmental impact of meat production in perspective. 80% of the corn grown in the U.S. is fed to livestock. And you have to think of the water, the pesticides required, and the fertilizer required to grow that corn. It takes 16 pounds of grain to produce 1 pound of animal flesh. 200 pounds of beef can be produced on an acre compared to 40,000 pounds of humble potatoes. 50 to 75% of U.S. topsoil is lost to livestock production. More than half of the water used in the U.S. goes to livestock production. It takes 5,000 gallons of water to grow a single pound of beef. It takes 25 gallons of water to grow a pound of wheat, 1 pound of wheat. 55% of all antibiotics made in the United States are delivered to healthy livestock. This is just a short list of the inherent inefficiencies of growing meat. As socially conscious consumers become increasingly aware of these environmental problems, they're opting for alternative methods of meat production. But these alternatives have environmental problems that the press, overly enamored with the idea of environmentally responsible meat, has been far too slow to highlight. So let's start with grass-fed beef. Grass-fed beef is a wildly popular alternative to conventional grain-fed beef. There's no doubt that in terms of saturated fat and in terms of omega-3s, it's much healthier. The evidence appears to me overwhelming on that point. But consider that a grass-fed cow emits 3 to 4 times the methane of corn-fed cows. Methane is a gas that's 30 times more potent than carbon dioxide. Also recall that grass-fed cows require 8 to 12 acres per cow to bring to slaughter weight, thus pressing on natural habitats such as rainforests as the product becomes more popular with privileged consumers. The grass that grass-fed cows consume is very often fertilized and irrigated. That's a grass-fed farm, adding significantly to energy costs. 2 peer-reviewed studies to have come out in the past year, in fact, show that grass-fed beef actually has a higher carbon footprint than conventionally raised beef. And the reason for that is the cows live longer. It takes them longer to bring to slaughter weight. One of those studies, I'm going to have to add it to this, came from Dalhousie University, and it's really worth reading. It came out last February, 2009. There's also the matter of E. coli and grass-fed cows. It is widely reported that grass-fed cows do not carry E. coli 0157, the kind that kills you. This is false. Food activist Nina Plank wrote about the bacteria strain on the op-ed page of the New York Times in 2006. At that time, people were getting sick from bad organic spinach. You probably remember this outbreak. But the spinach producers sure do. But the contamination seemed to have originated with herds of grain-fed cattle that lived upstream. Not every animal excretes this nasty type of E. coli, Plank argued. And here's her quote. "It's not found in the intestinal tracts of cattle raised on their natural diet of grass, hay, and other fibrous forage. No. 0157 thrives in a new, that is, recent in the history of animal diets, biological niche. The unnaturally acidic stomachs of beef and dairy cattle fed on grain, the typical ration on most industrial farms." Unquote. The Times speaks, the world listens. Plank's appraisal of grain versus grass-fed beef and E. coli went viral, appearing on websites for the Organic Consumers Union, the Center for a Livable Future, Grist, and Culinate.com, among other prominent food and agriculture and environment venues. Even Michael Pollan, perhaps the most widely read and recognized food writer on the planet, echoed this claim in the New York Times Magazine. These animals, he explained, quote, stand around in their manure all day, talking about grain-fed animals, stand around in their manure all day, eating a diet of grain that happens to turn a cow's rumen into an ideal habitat for E. coli 0157H7. So the case was closed. To avoid E. coli 0157, just eat grass-fed beef. But as it turned out, nobody had read the science. Nobody had looked at the scientific reports on E. coli in grass-fed cattle. As I showed in a January 2010 Slate article called "The Myth of Grass-Fed Beef," The claim is dead wrong. Between 2000 and 2006, scientists began to take a closer look at the effect of cow diet on E. coli 0157. And it turns out that this particular strain, 0157, does not behave like other strains of E. coli found in cattle guts. Most importantly, scientists showed in a half dozen studies that grass-fed cows do become colonized with E. coli 0157 at rates nearly the same, and in one case even higher, than grain-fed cattle, with consumers routinely advised to eat grass-fed beef rare or medium rare. The common assumption that it's free of E. coli is quite simply deadly misinformation. Let's look at free-range pork. Okay, I'm sorry, I should have had these up earlier, but these were the 2 examples of the reports that I read. Let's talk about free-range pork. Another popular option for socially conscious consumers upset with factory production. The problem here is as much ethical, I think, as it is environmental. And it begins with the fact that a pig's primary instinct is to root. This is an act, however, that destroys pastures. Most free-range pigs are thus affixed with nose rings. And as you can see, it's just a ring that's put into their nose so that when they root, it stings them, it pinches their nose. Most free-range, okay, this is something that not only hurts a pig physically, and again, not just when it's put on, but also as they do root, but damages him, for those of us who care about such things, damages him emotionally as well. Their stress hormones go way up when they have these rings put in. Ringing is nearly universal on free-range pig farms in the United States. Producers like the famed Nyman label, which has cultivated a pristine reputation for animal welfare standards, permit ringing. But that shouldn't obscure the contested nature of this procedure. In addition to the Soil Association, the Farm Animal Welfare Council in the United Kingdom officially opposes the practice, as does the Compassion in World Farming Organization and the UK's RSPCA. In the United States, the watchdog group Food and Water Watch supports the ban of nose ringing, and the Humane Society told me in an email to count them among the opposed as well. Pigs that are free-range certainly have a better chance to explore, there's no doubt. But their cageless existence also results in another dirty little secret. Sows roll over on and kill their babies at much higher rates than crated pigs. I've done interviews with several former free-range pig farmers who quit contracting with the Nyman production, the Nyman label, because, as one put it, and I'm quoting, "This is a big, tough pig farmer, too. I don't like finding dead piggies in my pasture." I agree, it makes neither economic or moral sense. Then there's the matter of pigs and disease. According to the animal scientist Temple Grandin, free-range pigs are more prone to contract trichinosis than caged ones. Although I took a major beating for reporting this point in the New York Times without noting that a study I cited was funded by the National Pork Council, live and learn. Study after study has found that free-ranged pigs, because they are more likely to encounter wildlife than caged pigs, are at a higher risk for contracting the disease. Then there's the matter of mutilation. Castration is almost universal for free-ranged pigs. The main reason free-range producers castrate is to ensure that an unpleasant taste known as boar taint, which comes at adolescence, doesn't pervade the meat. Free-range pigs reach adolescence because they take longer to fatten on pasture. With anesthesia, castration causes minor pain and a little post-operative swelling. Without anesthesia, it's truly an excruciating experience. The vast majority of U.S. producers castrate without anesthesia, and they justify this decision by castrating during the first weeks of a piglet's life, assuming that the 3-second procedure is less painful at this stage. According to a German study, however, neonates or infant pigs are capable of feeling pain and react more sensitively to pain than adults. Too often we hear free-range pork and think, happy pigs. But if you've ever witnessed a pig castration, you'll know how wrong this is. Now, one could retort to all these things I'm saying about free-range pigs and say, you know what, these practices can be avoided by ethical producers. Possibly. But keep in mind that, as with industrial farms, every technique just described is done to increase efficiency and improve the quality of the end product. As population and consumer demand grow, so will these troubling practices. And even if we can, as concerned consumers, find a local, ethical operation to patronize, and I know a lot of us do that, I still feel compelled to ask, don't we have a responsibility to raise our behavior to a categorical imperative? What would happen if our local operation multiplied to the point that all the world could eat the way we ate? Would it still be sustainable? If not, are we content to say, I can do this, but the rest of the world can't? The final alternative I want to critique is free-range chicken. When applied to chickens, the label free-range or cage-free is meaningless. According to USDA provisions, all that's necessary to be designated free-range is for animals to have theoretical access to the outdoors. There is no mention of the size of that space, ease of access, or the nature of the animal's indoor environment. That's a free-range system. Typically, a free-range chicken has access to about 1 to 2 square feet of room to move. According to some reports, disease rates are higher in free-range systems because there are no cages to raise them above the floor where they defecate. One study found the most common cause of chicken death on free-range farms to be E. coli. So unless they are organic, free-range chickens are also subject to the same rounds of antibiotics, growth hormones, vaccines, and corn-based feed that plague non-free-range systems. So as it stands, the designation is little more than a marketing gimmick to cover up business as usual. Final problem with respect to meat, alternative or not, involves the removal of dead stock. Most animals raised for meat in the U.S. die in a slaughterhouse, and only 40% of their overall body mass becomes an edible product. The other 60%, bones, blood, tendons, fibrous tissue, intestines, has to be processed, incinerated, or landfilled. This is true for both factory and alternatively raised animals. What we're left with is 1.4 billion pounds of livestock waste that every year must be dealt with through one energy-intensive method or another. Rendering used to be the means of choice, turning these carcasses into pet food and into cattle feed. That used to be the means of choice, but after mad cow disease, it's less an option as rendering plants closed due to stricter regulations and diminishing markets. Why are these issues not discussed in the mainstream news? I imagine for some of you, this is the first time you're hearing a lot of these criticisms of the alternatives. For reasons that I'm really unable to explain, the mainstream media routinely distorts scientific studies to favor the interests of the carnivore. We're always told that the media has a liberal bias. I don't know, but it definitely has a meat bias. One example just recently centers on an anti-meat report published in 2006 called Livestock's Long Shadow. This extensive study presented a wealth of data supporting the claim that global livestock production accounted for 18% of greenhouse gas emissions globally, almost 1/5 of all greenhouse gas emissions. To place their findings in perspective, the authors of the report, Livestock's Long Shadow, noted that this figure made livestock a greater contributor to global warming than the transportation sector. But Dr. Frank Mitloehner is how you say his name, Mitloehner, an animal scientist at UC Davis, was skeptical about the transportation comparison. With funding from the Beef Checkoff program, Mitloehner researched and wrote a peer-reviewed article called, quote, "Clearing the Air: Livestock's Contribution to Climate Change." In a talk delivered last month to the American Chemical Society, he drew upon this article to challenge the claim that livestock produced more greenhouse gas than transportation. Basically, he said, look, the analysis that you used for livestock is right, it's fine, but you didn't use the same analysis for transportation. The life cycle analysis that was used for transportation was much lighter than the one that was used for livestock. And he made that point, and it was highly publicized, and the authors of The Livestock's Long Shadow, who's made the transportation comparison, said, really something rarely happens in scientific debates. They kind of went back to the report and said, oh, shoot, you're right. We screwed up. We don't know what the transportation figure is, but that 18% still stands, sure. Mittler did nothing to challenge the 18% claim, nor did he take on the World Watch Institute's claim that the actual figure was 51%. That was last year that figure came out. Mittler was only taking issue with the offhand transportation comparison. Now, I went into that story to set this up. The media went wild with this. Here is a sample of the headlines from major news outlets. Quote, eat less meat, reduce global warming, or not. Next quote, meat, dairy, not tied to global warming. Completely false. Quote, veggies are wrong, and eating less meat will not save the planet. These are headlines. And my favorite, go veggie to prevent warming, bull. Not bad. The more I compare media coverage of food issues to the actual scientific reports, the more gloomy a person I become. The average American eats 250 pounds of meat a year. This has to change. We must be prepared as ethical consumers to recognize the inherent inefficiencies and welfare challenges of meat production. We must be prepared to reduce our own meat consumption, promote policies that prevent India and China from eating the same way we do. We must be prepared to provide farmers incentives to do something that in today's agribusiness culture is quite radical, and that is grow healthy food intended to be eaten directly by healthy people. 2 premises, 4 principles. 1, rather uncomfortable behavioral change. This is my blueprint. Given the inherently controversial nature of every proposal I offer, these ideas are not likely to make much headway in the increasingly intense and dichotomized discourse about food and agriculture. I suspect that many of you sitting in the audience spent much of my lecture disagreeing with things that I had to say. This is good. This is healthy. All I can hope for as I work through this material, very much as an outsider, as I reflect upon it and put it out there for discussion, is that conscientious consumers will be willing to take on more complexity as they think about their own food choices. Over and over again, we're told that food is simple. It's not. Thank you.